the heart of a suburban neighborhood, neatly arranged homes stood shoulder to shoulder, their manicured lawns and carefully trimmed hedges forming a picture-perfect image of community life. To outsiders, the place looked like a peaceful retreat, where families could live without worry, but those who resided inside knew better. Behind the neat fences and polished driveways lurked an organization that held more power than it ever should have. The Homeowners Association. The HOA controlled everything, from the color of shutters to the height of grass. It governed not with compassion, but with cold precision, and the residents quickly learned that compliance meant peace, while resistance meant punishment. Daniel, a retired veteran, had chosen this community because he longed for quiet stability. After years of military service and the heavy burden of combat memories, he wanted a safe environment where he could rebuild life for himself and his children. The choice had not been made lightly. He had researched neighborhoods, checked schools, and saved for years to secure a home here. On the surface, it seemed perfect. Yet what Daniel did not realize was that this HOA had a reputation for ruthless enforcement of its rules, a reputation that would soon turn his dream into a nightmare. What made Daniel different from many of his neighbors was not his appearance or his home, but the presence of Shadow, his service dog. Shadow was a large, dark-coated German shepherd, carefully trained to detect and respond to Daniel's medical condition. When nightmares shook Daniel awake, Shadow was there. When dizziness threatened to overwhelm him, Shadow steadied his balance. Shadow was not a pet in any ordinary sense. He was Daniel's lifeline, an extension of his health and independence. For months, Daniel lived quietly in the neighborhood. He walked Shadow in the mornings, waved politely to his neighbors, and kept his yard tidy. He paid his HOA dues on time, followed the rules about trash cans and mailboxes, and never once caused a disturbance. To anyone watching, he was simply another homeowner doing his best to live in peace. But that peace was shattered one cold afternoon when an envelope arrived in his mailbox. The envelope bore the HOA's official seal, and its contents would change everything. Inside was a notice of violation. The letter stated, with chilling formality, that Daniel's dog violated the association's pet policy. According to the rules, no animal over a certain weight was permitted within the community. The letter went on to say that Shadow, regardless of training or purpose, must be removed from the property within 30 days. If Daniel refused, he would face escalating fines, liens on his home, and potential legal action. The words hit Daniel like a hammer. Shadow was not a pet to be regulated under arbitrary weight restrictions. He was protected by federal law. The Americans with Disabilities Act and the Fair Housing Act made clear that service animals were not subject to the same rules as household pets. Yet the HOA letter ignored all of this. It treated Shadow as nothing more than a nuisance, as if Daniel's needs did not matter, as if his years of service and sacrifice meant nothing. At first, Daniel hoped it was a mistake. He reached out to the HOA with documentation explaining Shadow's role as a service animal. He sent training certificates and letters from his doctor, believing reason would prevail. But the response he received was colder than the first. The HOA president, a woman notorious for her rigid interpretation of rules, wrote back that exceptions could not be made. If one resident was allowed to break the rules, she argued, others would demand the same. The weight limit was absolute, and Shadow was simply too large. From that moment on, the pressure grew unbearable. Fines began arriving in Daniel's mailbox, each one larger than the last. Notices were taped to his front door for neighbors to see, branding him as non-compliant. Whispers spread through the neighborhood. Some residents offered quiet sympathy, but others echoed the board's rhetoric, claiming Shadow was dangerous, noisy, or bad for property values. Daniel's children heard rumors at school, and even Shadow seemed unsettled by the growing hostility, staying closer to Daniel than ever before. The stress wore heavily on him. Each letter, Each fine, each hostile glance from a neighbor chipped away at his resolve. Yet Daniel was no stranger to adversity. He had faced worse than intimidation and paperwork. His military service had taught him discipline, persistence, and the importance of standing his ground when something truly mattered. And this fight mattered more than any other, because it was not just about Shadow. It was about Daniel's right to live with dignity, to be recognized as more than a violation notice pinned to a door. Instead of crumbling under the pressure, Daniel began preparing for battle. He documented every letter, every interaction, every threat. He kept copies of fines, recorded phone calls, and even photographed the notices left on his door. He researched tirelessly, studying disability rights law and housing protections late into the night. What he found only fueled his determination. The HOA was not only wrong, it was breaking the law. Daniel reached out to veteran support organizations, explaining the harassment he faced. Word spread quickly among those who understood the importance of service animals. Soon, Daniel connected with a disability rights attorney who specialized in housing discrimination. The attorney reviewed his documentation and confirmed what Daniel already knew. The HOA had crossed a line, and the law was firmly on his side. The HOA, accustomed to unquestioned authority, had no idea what was coming. They believed fines and intimidation would force compliance, as it always had before. They underestimated Daniel, thinking him just another homeowner powerless against the board. But this time, they had chosen the wrong opponent. The calm streets of the neighborhood now hid the beginnings of a storm. A storm fueled by arrogance on one side and determination on the other. And as Daniel prepared to take the HOA to court, the balance of power began to shift. For the first time, residents started to whisper not about Shadow's presence, but about the board's cruelty. The HOA had tried to make an example out of Daniel, but instead they had set the stage for their own reckoning. What began as a letter in a mailbox was about to grow into a battle that would shake the very foundation of the community. And as the deadline for Shadow's removal approached, Daniel was no longer afraid. He was ready. The 30-day deadline came and went, but Shadow remained faithfully by Daniel's side. True to his attorney's advice, Daniel did not yield to the HOA's demands. Instead, he kept records of every threat and fine that arrived. But the HOA, unwilling to admit defeat, escalated its tactics. What had begun as letters in the mailbox transformed into something far more aggressive, and soon the entire neighborhood was watching the conflict unfold. The first escalation was financial. The HOA began stacking fines at an alarming rate. What started as a $100 penalty for each week, Shadow remained quickly multiplied into hundreds, then thousands. They claimed Daniel owed administrative fees on top of fines, citing vague policies hidden deep in the HOA handbook. By the second month, the total exceeded several $1,000s. Each statement arrived with bold red letters screaming, "Final notice," as though they could bully Daniel into surrender. Daniel's attorney assured him that the fines were unenforceable under federal disability laws, but the HOA was not concerned with legality. They were playing a game of intimidation, hoping Daniel would either remove Shadow or abandon his home altogether. The tactic was cruel but familiar. This board had a history of pushing out residents who challenged their authority. Yet what they did not understand was that Daniel had faced battles far worse than paperwork and harassment. Their tactics only hardened his resolve. Next came the public shaming. One morning, Daniel awoke to find a bright orange notice taped to his front door, warning the community that he was in violation of HOA pet regulations. It was written in bold, capitalized letters and left there for hours before he discovered it. Neighbors passing by could not miss it. Some shook their heads disapprovingly, while others avoided eye contact altogether. Daniel removed the notice quietly, but his children saw it first. The humiliation stung. not just for him but for the family that had already endured enough. The HOA then began targeting Shadow directly. Anonymous complaints poured in, accusing the dog of barking at night, intimidating children, and damaging common areas. None of it was true. Shadow was impeccably trained, calm and silent except when alerting Daniel to medical needs. Still, the HOA used these false reports to build a case for removal, filing them neatly into their growing stack of accusations. It was clear they were preparing for war, fabricating evidence to strengthen their position. Daniel kept documenting. He filmed Shadow's behavior, showing the dog calmly resting beside him, walking obediently on a leash, and responding to commands. He collected testimonies from neighbors who respected Shadow and knew the complaints were baseless. His attorney encouraged him to remain calm, reminding him that every unjust action only strengthened their eventual case. But calmness did not come easily. The pressure of constant conflict weighed heavily, testing Daniel's patience and resilience. The board's arrogance only grew. At monthly HOA meetings, the president openly mocked Daniel, claiming that rules applied equally to everyone, and no one was special. They painted his fight as selfish, accusing him of undermining the community for his own convenience. Minutes from these meetings, later shared with residents, twisted the truth into propaganda. The narrative became one of a stubborn homeowner refusing to respect community standards. Few residents dared to speak up in Daniel's defense, fearing the wrath of the board would turn on them next. But beneath the surface, quiet support was building. Some neighbors, disgusted by the HOA's cruelty, began reaching out privately. They dropped off notes of encouragement, whispered words of solidarity during morning walks, and offered to testify when the time came. It wasn't much, but it reminded Daniel he was not entirely alone. Shadow, too, remained a constant source of strength. On nights when the stress became unbearable, Daniel found comfort in the steady rhythm of Shadow's breathing at his side. The bond between man and dog deepened with each passing day, and Daniel knew without a doubt that this fight was worth every ounce of energy. As months passed, the conflict reached new levels. The HOA filed a lien against Daniel's home, claiming unpaid fines and threatening foreclosure. It was a shocking escalation, one that turned a dispute over a service animal into a battle for his very livelihood. The lien was legally baseless, as his attorney quickly pointed out, but the threat of losing his home was terrifying nonetheless. For many, this tactic would have been the breaking point. For Daniel, it was confirmation that the board had gone too far. The attorney prepared a formal complaint, citing violations of federal law, harassment, and discrimination. The case was submitted to housing authorities and soon caught the attention of disability rights organizations. Word began to spread beyond the community. What had been a local conflict was becoming a matter of national interest, and the HOA's arrogance was about to be exposed on a much larger stage. Meanwhile, Daniel continued life as best he could. He refused to let the HOA's harassment steal his peace entirely. He walked Shadow every morning, greeted friendly neighbors, and tended his yard with the same care as always. To him, these small acts of normalcy were acts of defiance. Every smile, every wave, every quiet evening spent on his porch with Shadow at his side was proof that the HOA had not broken him. The board, however, mistook his calm for weakness. They doubled down, sending letters threatening court action, hiring private security to monitor common areas, and even attempting to intimidate Shadow by approaching too closely during walks. Each action was documented, reported, and prepared for the coming legal storm. By the time the first official hearing date arrived, the neighborhood was buzzing. Some whispered that Daniel would finally be forced to surrender, while others quietly hoped the board would be exposed for the tyrants they were. The HOA had grown accustomed to winning through fear and pressure, but this time they had underestimated their opponent. Daniel was no ordinary homeowner. He was a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, who had endured far greater battles than petty neighborhood politics. And this time, he had the law firmly on his side. As Daniel sat at his kitchen table the night before the hearing, reviewing documents with his attorney, Shadow rested his head on Daniel's knee. The weight of the dog's presence was grounding, a silent reminder that this fight was bigger than fines and notices. It was about dignity, rights, and respect. The HOA had turned Shadow into a symbol of defiance, but to Daniel, he was simply family. And no matter the cost, he would protect that family. The next morning, as the sun rose over the manicured lawns of the neighborhood, Daniel knew the true battle was only just beginning. The HOA believed they had pushed him into a corner, but in reality, they had ignited a fight that would expose their corruption to everyone watching.